Dear God in heaven, we again give you thanks and praise for the blessings, many blessings that you pour out upon us. We thank you for this opportunity to come together in fellowship. And we do pray a special blessing for all those here and all those who have not been able to attend this morning. We pray that you will keep everyone safe and well at this time of the year, especially with all the busyness that's on the roads. We just again ask for a special blessing with this meeting. We ask your Holy Spirit will work both through what I'm presenting, through me, and also through those who are hearing the message. And again, we just give thanks and praise, and we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. This morning, I'm going over a Vespers presentation of Elder Tess's that was presented on the 22nd of April in 2022. I'm sort of adding a few little bits and pieces, not a lot. It's basically just some of the more recent things that we've been looking at. And just make the comment that in the past few years, in particular since 2018, as a movement, we've really been on quite a journey. And most recently in our Vespers meetings, we've been looking a lot more closely into the dragon power discussed in Revelation 16. And I'll just remind us that in Revelation 14:8, it talks about Babylon being that great city. And in Revelation 16:19, we see that Babylon's divided into three parts. And then in Revelation 16:13, it states those three parts are named as the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. And I'll just write that up here. So we have great city, and we have three parts. And then in the final one, Revelation 16:13, it's talking about the dragon, tells you what the three parts are: the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Just got it in there. So I think we're all familiar with this, but the reason that I'm just bringing that to our attention is the fact that as Seventh-day Adventists, we've mainly focused on the beast and the false prophet. And even if we didn't fully understand it properly, just as far as the parts they were going to play in these final moments of Earth history, they were not a surprise to us. We understood roughly who they were. So we've been getting a lot more light in more recent years, of course, but still that was our primary focus. Now, more recently, we've really been looking at this power here. So the dragon. So this has been a focus of more recent Vespers studies with Elder Carey, and I think that's really important, and it's relevant today, as you'll see. We've always seen paganism in a sense, but we haven't paid a lot of attention to it. And we know that paganism is the daily, from studies Elder Tess has been going into, Elder Carey, beg your pardon. And so we know that that's a religious power. So we've always kind of seen that as primitive paganism in a sense, which still exists. But what we didn't really understand, I think, as well, was that atheism is a part of paganism, or a part of this daily. So paganism, which is actually what makes up this dragon power, and atheism is this is very significant, especially as we're coming up to these towards our Sunday law. So we can appreciate the fact that atheism is a part of that daily. And so in this presentation that I'm reviewing today, it was really interesting to me at the time when I was reviewing it that Elder Tess, her opening words were, I'll quote, "We are studying the Midnight Cry, and that surprises me. Over all these years since 2018, we are still studying the two streams of information. And I think that's something to keep in mind, because whenever we're having any presentation, it's really important that we see these two streams of information, because that's the crux. It's a simplified version of what's going on. As we're now going on, we're learning more detail, we're learning more complex information, but that's the crux of the matter. It's the two streams of information. So it's always good to have that in the back of our mind. Now, because of the Midnight Cry as a movement, we've seen the shift we've taken, not just moving from the right to the left, and I've got this here illustrated. We've got the left wing and we've got the right wing, and we were definitely over here. So we've had to see that was not the place to be, because that was the wrong stream, and we can see these as two streams, and so we had to be over here. So what we've also been learning is that not everything over here is what it seems. We still have to sift in order to determine the two streams, because it's like a bit of pollution from that wrong stream has infiltrated this, which is not surprising when you think about it. So in this simplistic way, we've seen the left stream as the true stream, and we've started to recognize how some of these ideologies, some of the people on this side have ideologies that actually are in common with this side. So it's very important that we're able to sift that information and not just accept everything as being correct. So through those Vespers studies, we've been taking a much closer look at determining things like libertarianism that would basically, we would think at first sounded good. We've learned that it's actually not as good as it immediately appears, things like that. We've also come to recognise all reputable sources are not necessarily just to be accepted ad infinitum. We've got to actually look more closely, make sure we're sifting to refine the process of how we sort that information. And back in April, when Elder Tess was presenting this, Elon Musk was at the time making a bid for the purchase of Twitter, which at that time did fall through. But we know since then he's been successful. And we can start to see now what Elder Tess knew would be happening, but what at the time we weren't able to see. But we can see the ramifications starting to happen in regards to his, or to that freedom ethos mentality, which is really what we are having to, I suppose, understand more clearly. So we've got two political ideologies with these two streams, and we look at the fact that we've got over here, they value freedom at utmost over equality. However, when we look at the true stream, we can see that it's actually equality that has to govern freedom. Something has to keep freedom in check, because unfettered freedom becomes a problem. And we've seen in other studies how God's government is based on this ethos, not this ethos. And looking at this from a simple perspective, we can also see this same simple summary, if you like, of at Eden to Eden. We've got in Eden, we had God versus Satan, and you could even put it in a very simplistic way as God was left wing, Satan right wing. Now we know that's a very simple version. The complexity of it is different, but for the sake of the simplicity, Elder Tess mentioned it in this light. So what we saw there then was there was a choice that God gave Adam and Eve. Of course, it wasn't just an uninformed choice. They had been given enough information to understand the ramifications of what God's government was about. They knew the consequences of their choice would affect not just them, but all of creation and forevermore. So basically, it was a political choice. God presented the principles of his government and said, don't eat of the tree. Whereas Satan runs a campaign, opposing campaign where he's accusing God of trying to restrain them, restrict them, to take away some of their freedom. He says, if you want to come up to a higher state of being with power and freedom then you just vote for me and you can eat of this tree. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with the tree, according to him. So God just wants to stop you from becoming like gods, in fact. Now, Satan ran a successful campaign, and Adam and Eve both voted for him, and consequently, Satan was able to legally claim this earth. And it was Adam and Eve's free will that gave them the option to make that choice. Of course, God has been running a campaign ever since with the aim of winning back whoever he can to his form of government. And with this goal in mind, God moved us back from the right wing over to the left wing so that we could start to see what God's government is about. Now, Elder Tess took us to an article from the Washington Post where it was a discussion about Elon Musk's intention to create a free speech utopia. And I'll just share my screen just to show you what the article was. I might just go over here to do that. There we go. I'll just double check if everyone can see this okay. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Lynne.
You can see that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can see it, Lynne.
So, excellent. Thank you. So, Elon Musk wants a free speech utopia. Technologists clap back. Now, Musk's vision of the internet is outdated and doesn't take into account the real world, they say. So, there were people even back then, this was published in April, who could recognize the problems that were about to unfold. Now, I haven't copied the whole article. I've just copied a few quotes from the article. And it just states about Elon Musk said his bid wasn't about making money. He goes, my strong intuitive sense is that having a public platform that is maximally trusted and broadly inclusive is extremely important to the future of civilization, he said. Now, we know that this is an interesting concept, especially with some of the information Elder Terry's been sharing regarding the existential threats, the concept of being the future, having the altruistic type view of trying to preserve everything for the future generations, which far exceed our generation. So it says here also, some pro-free speech networks have been found by researchers to be havens for white supremacists and those who wished to harm society. Now, tech executives argue that Musk's ideals arose out of a time when the internet served a different purpose, when concerns about government repression and news organisations as gatekeepers for free speech led to early social media pioneers, including Twitter's own founders, to believe free expression was paramount above all other ideals. So when we, let's see, I'll just stop sharing for a second, I think. Yeah. So we see the battle with the underlying ethos or ideology driving these culture wars. Basically, people starting these tech companies all have this, they value freedom. And of course, it's not surprising when you've got that focus from the Constitution. And so people value freedom to the point where they don't fully understand or appreciate the consequences when you make freedom, especially freedom of speech on the internet, the most important thing. And I think some of these tech platforms did find out that it started to become a problem, and they started to realize that there had to be things like moderation, and it was something that they had to start to really work on in a way that they didn't necessarily expect to. And I think with recent developments, we're kind of seeing a little bit of that with Musk and Twitter as well. But so Elder Tess also made some comments when she presented these articles in the media broadcast, and she just stated that the situation of this article describes an interesting and neat example of where freedom and equality collide, and the fight over which principle should then take precedence. So this is, you could say, this is the great controversy for us now. This is the fight. Which is going to take priority, equality or freedom? And she also said it also gives some history of the platforms such as Twitter, where in their early days the creators saw free speech as the antidote to global problems and considered their platforms to be champions of free speech. Only when they began to see the harm that they bore some responsibility for did their mindset begin to change. And of course, there are some platforms that haven't fully changed their mindset, and we can still see some of those examples with platforms like Reddit, where it's a bit of a breeding ground for that culture that's this far right. So the important point is how the article talks about those individuals, including Musk, who probably you could describe as idealistic and romanticized in their outlook. So if not misinformed, they're idealistic at least. So basically they have this real fixation, I guess, on the importance of free speech. So the article highlights how they don't appreciate the practical application of those ideals when it comes to moderation of a tech platform such as a social media site. And just to add to that, I'll just mention something that's happened on the 27th of October. Musk said, and this is to quote, "He didn't buy Twitter to make more money. I did it to try to help humanity whom I love." So he loves humanity. He saw this as a way of helping humanity. He didn't see it as a way to make money. So it was a project really close to his ethos and his heart, if you like. Excuse me. But since then, of course, even more issues have arisen. And just recently, Musk closed some accounts of some journalists. So he started moderating. And it was interesting that those accounts that he closed, he accused of doxing him and exposing the exact coordinates of his family's location. So he viewed them as a personal threat to his family and his family's safety. It'll be interesting to see if he appreciates the personal threat that may be made towards some other people, such as women, for example, and what he would do about that. And it's interesting also to note that some of the journalists that he banned were from CNN and the New York Times. He also closed the account of someone who was tracking and publishing the coordinates of his private jet, even though this information is actually publicly available elsewhere. So anyone who really wanted to could find that out for themselves. So perhaps Musk is starting to experience, if you like, the complications surrounding unfettered free speech. So it's through, as I mentioned, learning the hard way that some of these owners have had to start looking at the difficulty with moderating these so-called free speech platforms. Now, I'll just share my screen again because it just talks about the some of what we've just said. I won't necessarily. Okay, I'll just read this quickly. So some pro-free speech networks have been found by researchers to be havens for white supremacists and those who wish them to harm society. So for some reason, these online platforms. Oh, am I sharing? No, I'm not. I just realised I didn't click the second button.
And your audio's out of sync, Lynne, just to let you know. If you get it, there's a delay, so if people don't respond.
Yeah, thank you. I still have to try to solve the problem of my computer running things, so that's still an issue for me, even though I'm attempting it. But anyway. So yeah, so with these quotes, it also said tech executives argue that Musk's ideals arose out of a time concerns about government repression, news organisations as gatekeepers for speech led to early social media pioneers, including Twitter's own founders, to believe free expression was paramount above all others ideals. I think I actually quoted that earlier, but anyway. Okay.
Sorry, Lynne, it might just be me, but it's only just popped up for me. The quotes. Maybe
Yeah,
everyone
okay,
else's.
thank you. Yeah, I'll have to keep that in mind. My system's running a little slow because it's having trouble running everything, but I don't really have a lot on it, so I'm not quite sure why it's behaving the way it is. Let me just double check.
So it has rectified itself a little in that what happens is your speech goes really, really fast and catches up.
Okay. Well,
so you're
I
with us
apologise
again
for the
now.
problems. Excellent. Okay, thanks. I'll just stop the screen share. So actually, I know I'll actually go back to screen share, come to think of it.
It might pay to go over that point again because it read very fast.
Okay, I'll do that. So what I was looking at, if you can see my screen, hopefully, was the fact that it was just highlighting the fact that these owners of these, or the gatekeepers, as it says here, for speech, led to early social media pioneers, including Twitter's own founders, to believe free expression was paramount above all other ideals. And this is where we see it becoming a breeding ground for the white supremacists and those who really have very radical views and wish to, well, even those who wish to harm society, if not just change it altogether. So I had another quote here that was an article from Yishan Wong, a former CEO of the internet platform Reddit, and Esther Crawford, a Twitter executive. They had a conversation, or in this article, which Wong, along with others, pointed out that if Musk were to take control of Twitter, he would be in for a world of pain because of the challenges of moderation. Given the misunderstandings that exist around free speech on platforms, I sometimes think it's hard to grasp until you're on the front line, having to make these decisions to get the gravity and the difficulty of the work, tweeted Esther Crawford, a Twitter executive whose own social network Squad was acquired by Twitter. I'm very pro free speech, but there must be limits for the health of a platform and to ensure the safety of people. So they recognise that. So it'll be interesting, and we hope that, we hope that more of these executives and more of these these people who own these platforms will realise the dangers that exist. Now, there's another article, I'll continue while I've got the screen sharing, that Elder Tess went into. Hold on, and it's to do with, she wanted to see us to see that, okay, no, I won't, I'll stop sharing the screen for the minute because I've got a little bit of comment to make. So Elder Tess wanted us to see that Protestantism, and I'll just put this on the board, we originally saw Protestantism as the problem over this side. And Elder Test wanted us to note that Protestantism, or what she said could be more said to be dominionism, or religion, but religion in the context of Protestantism and Dominionism. She said it's not really the whole of this. So she was explaining the fact that we originally thought that these things took up the whole of the right. We thought they were the main focus. We thought these were the problems. And we thought if we could address this problem, then we've got it, I suppose, under control in our own thinking. However, what she found was, as she was looking into these topics, is that it wasn't the whole, it was just a part. And not only wasn't it the whole, but it also wasn't the cause. So it's not the whole, and it's also not the cause. So what is the whole and what is the cause? That's the question, because this is just a part. And this is where she started to be able to look further into other factors and of the far right that were actually playing a huge part in this. And they could be said to be religious powers, and that's what we're looking at, but not in the traditional sense that we tend to think of religion in this box here. So since 2018, in the initial presentations of the Midnight Cry, we've spent most of our time targeting religion, in particular Protestantism and Dominionism, and Dominionists like Ted Cruz. So if Dominionism isn't the whole of the problem and it's not the cause, what is? So we now went to another article where atheists in particular were looking at what is causing the problem. And as you might expect, atheists would see religion as the problem, because that's where they feel their focus is. That's their enemy, if you like. And it was an interesting conversation as it played out, because there was an article where Sarah Henry was interviewing Alex DeBranco. No, yes, that's correct, I believe. Alex DeBranco. She was interviewing Alex DeBranco. Now, Sarah Henry they're both atheists, and so one atheist interviewing another. Alex DeBranco is a sociologist, a journalist, and a researcher who is studying the founding and development of the conservative movement in the USA. And DeBranco starts where we'd expect her to start. And I'll just share the screen again. This might take a second to pop up, but hopefully it'll come up reasonably quickly. So when this comes up, you'll see. I'll just start reading it anyway, and hopefully it'll pop up soon. So while the original research, DeBranco says, while my original research focused on the Christian right and anti-abortion movements, which is where you'd expect it to be starting, I also worked as an activist on sexual violence issues. And starting in the early 2010s, I was watching men's rights activists like Paul Elam and their victim-blaming rhetoric. Over time, I became more concerned with the growth of secular misogynist movements. By the time Donald Trump was elected president, I had been pushing for some years for the social justice organisations to expand their focus on reproductive justice to a more inclusive gender justice framework that would theorise rape culture as a right-wing ideology. This misogyny demonstrated by Trump's campaign brought new interest to this subject, and I was able to start writing and speaking in key venues about the threat posed by male supremacism. Unfortunately, the subject continued to be understudied and treated as a secondary concern or gateway to ideologies taken more seriously, like white supremacism, rather than being recognised as a threat by itself. I was fortunate, however, to meet a few emerging scholars who were also focusing on misogynist ideology, and we began to build collaborative projects and support one another. The Institute for Research on Male Supremacism developed out of that collaboration, and I'm very grateful to my co-founders. So Sarah Henry replies with what might be expected perspective, again, from an atheist. So it seems to me that more often than not, religious dominionism, white nationalism, and male supremacy are inextricably intertwined. So that was an interesting observation. Is that something you've found in your work? What prompted you to specifically focus on male supremacy in your new venture? And DeBranco says, I would actually have to say that contemporary white supremacist and male supremacist communities demonstrate more of what I term secular misogyny, which includes what appears to be an overrepresentation of atheists with regards to their small percentage of the population. Now, that's a key point. So what she's noticing is over this side, she has an overrepresentation of atheists compared to how they're spread in the general population. And so that really indicates why it's such an important movement to be aware of. So Sarah Henry sort of focuses on the intertwining of the religious dominionism, white nationalists, and male supremacy, whereas Alex DeBranco then points out the significant, or how significant the non-religious part, non-religious from their perspective, part of the equation has become, to the point where it contains a significant number of atheists. So that, yes, they are intertwined, and that is something we have had to be more aware of. And we've been studying with a view to understanding how atheism is also paganism. So we can see now that atheism is a type of a religion in itself, even though they don't consider themselves religious, because they consider themselves scientific and basing on logic and fact. But we've seen that a third of Babylon, that great city, as I mentioned before, includes that dragon, which is paganism. And we've also seen from Elder Terry's studies how basically how atheism is very much a huge part of paganism. It's significant, especially for us at this point in time. So just to find the pen. So we have the far right trinity identified in that article. And we saw that it was men's rights activists, or RA for the sake of shortness, and we have obviously atheism, and we have the messy three. We have libertarianism as the third. Now we refer to this as a secular trinity or the far right trinity, and it is a type of counterfeit, I guess, of the true trinity in a way. So we've looked at that as well. So we see that even you could really look at all of these in some respects as having religious fervor, because they've all got their own focus as to who the enemy is, and they basically, so we've got, let's just move that down. Yeah, each of them have their main focus as to who the enemy is for them, which I'll cover in a little bit in a moment. So it's important that we can see the proper perspective. We need to take a step back and look at that whole picture, because the whole picture is not just this. So the whole picture is going to include more of this. And that's particularly important because of our Sunday law issue of sexism. So, and we'll see a little bit more as to why that is. When we see it in the correct external context, we can see it's a combination of atheism, libertarianism, and the misogyny that's encompassed in the men's rights activist movements, which provides the foundational principles of the far right. And of course, libertarianism is like freedom at all costs. So that totally fits in with the views of the people in this far right far right ethos. So once we recognise it's not older white Christian males who we would suggest fill this gap here, it's actually more a younger segment of the community, and we saw that in the Vox article about Max, who was approximately 27 years of age and is a typical representation of the younger male generation. And we also see this when we look at the problems which surfaced during Gamergate and the younger white male demographic, also the incel movement. This secular trinity is more indicative of America's future than it is of the past, and therefore we can see the danger of the lamb-like beast is in. So the United States as the lamb-like beast is in huge danger because of the significant influence over society and the fact that they are what I guess you could almost say they're almost appearing to win the culture wars that are going on at the moment. And Max, if you remember, he stated in the article, or the journalist who was interviewing Max stated about Max, that Max doesn't think much of feminism in general, or at least of what he says feminism became once the voting and the jobs and the abortion rights were sorted, and the word became a dog whistle for self-pity and sexism towards men. And we've seen that where you have a reaction from men's rights activists to feeling that they're the ones who are now being basically prejudiced against and who are being words gone out of my head, but basically they're the ones who are having the problem now and things are against them. So Max thinks that feminism is sorted because they have the right to vote and they're in the workforce and they have abortion rights. And in actual fact, that's an interesting comment given what we know has happened this year with Roe versus Wade. So even though that article was some years ago, we can see now that none of those rights were set in cement, really, because they've actually really undone the Roe versus Wade situation. So Max, with that similar outlook, Max and those with a similar outlook, which is a lot of people in that demographic, feel they uphold women's freedom and they're fine with gay marriage, but what they're not okay with is equality. So they feel like they give everyone the right to freedom like they want, but they don't really understand how equality is actually the most important thing. And they're not okay with equality, because once you start fighting for equality, it's a problem because it actually costs men some of their freedom and they don't want to lose any of their freedom. And this is why the alternative trinity opposes the parts of the Civil Rights Act. So these really oppose parts of that Civil Rights Act because they see it as attacking their freedom. So once women get equality and men lose some of their freedoms, then they start to bring the self-pity and reverse sexism and talk about how they are now the victims. So women, right over here. So women want freedom, and to an extent, you could say they have freedom. But we look at Max, and he says he's okay with freedom. They can have freedom, that's fine. However, they also want equality. Now, that means Max is not so happy because that means he's going to lose some freedom. Therefore, that's a problem for Max. So he doesn't want equality for that reason, because he feels his freedom's paramount. Again, we see this mentality playing out. So this is where they oppose two titles in the Titles 2 and 7 of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I won't go into what they are specifically, but it's all about equality, not freedom, in those two particular titles. So basically, from Max's perspective, put Max in there, he sees that, as just to labour the point, that women have freedom, and if they want equality, that's going to mean he's going to lose some of his freedom, and that he feels is against what the right considers the Constitution is about. And then therefore they're the recipients of reverse sexism, and they're being discriminated against because they're losing some of their freedoms. So this triggers, obviously, I don't know whether you can see this. Can we see this on? Oh yeah, self-pity, and also reverse sexism. So it's the men's activist movements which are feeling restricted and pressured by the appropriate parts of the left-wing society, who they see are against their freedom, who want to treat women, because a large proportion of the left wing want to treat women with equality. So these men's rights activists feel that they're losing their freedoms, and they're losing their freedom to behave in ways which are misogynistic, and in some cases it's impacting their careers and their freedom to speak and act the way they want. So they have a feeling of oppression and self-pity because, as they see it, they're being discriminated against. And they blame radical feminists because they feel that they're the ones to men. Now, Elder Tess talked about Uganda and how when she was there, she saw extreme oppression of women to the point where they don't even have their freedom, let alone equality. So it's just interesting to note what's behind the problems here is fear. Fear is the core of what's going on, both in dominionism and the secular trinity. So they all work on the fear that they're going to lose their ability to freedom. We've seen that with Protestantism and dominionism, who feel that they're going to lose their rights to practice religious freedom. But it's really a huge issue because the majority of the population, especially outside of the United States, is not heavily Christian based. It's more based on this secular trinity, which is also a very huge amount of the United States. So this same fear was also behind 1888, where the Dominionists were so afraid of the Irish Catholics, the Jews, to a similar extent, and even Seventh-day Adventists at the time. They were afraid of these movements coming to oppress them. So they felt that it needed to be instilled into the Constitution at the time to enshrine Sunday as the Sabbath to protect their own supremacy, avoiding what they saw would be themselves being oppressed. And they saw that as not just a future thing, but they actually felt they were being oppressed at that time, which, if you look at it, you can see isn't really true. The ones who were being oppressed were actually the Irish immigrants, the Jewish immigrants, and even Seventh-day Adventists. They were all being oppressed. And even secular humanists and atheists were being oppressed in 1888 because of that dominant Protestant-led church-state movement, which probably has added fuel to who atheism sees as the enemy as well. So yes, there was oppression, And there is oppression today of people of different races or immigrants or even Jews. We still see some of that. And often there's hostility, you know, for example, towards, I know, well, different countries, people from Asia or Muslim cultures, etc. So there is oppression, and in the Sunday law context, the most, as we know from Elder Tess's statements, that the most fundamental and deepest set and widespread and generally the worst oppression in human society is misogyny, and we've seen that illustrated throughout from the beginning, since Eden, since Eve's fall. Well, not just since Eve's fall, since Eve and Adam's fall, but particularly around the issue of Eve at the time. So there was an oppression now, and there's an oppression in there's also oppression in 1850 with slavery, and it was about the South, who claimed to be oppressed by Abraham Lincoln over the enlarged government of their northern government. So they felt that government was too big and it was oppressing them in the South. And this is all a part of that fear that people are going to lose what they have. And in their case, it was slaves. They didn't want to lose the slaves who they felt were serving their almost divine purpose. So yes, it's interesting because it's always, well, it's often, no, always probably, those who feel that their freedom's being taken, who feel that they are being oppressed, but it's them who are actually doing the oppressing. So they don't see it in its true context. And we can look back now and we can see how those in the South who were keeping slaves, who thought that slavery was actually God's divine mandate, that was... we can see how they felt oppressed, but we could also see how they were the ones doing the oppressing. And we can see this pattern is still happening today. So I'll just try doing that. So we still see that today with men's rights groups. We see how they are starting to feel their freedoms being taken away because of equality being demanded by some groups. Therefore, they see them as being the oppressed, when really it's their behaviour that's oppressing those others and preventing equality. And there was another example that was given about what was happening in Florida, because there was a movement against the LGBTQ community, that they were impacting the culture of Florida, and basically they felt that school children were being suppressed and harmed. They felt, but it actually wasn't cisgender or heterosexual people who claimed they were the victims. It was actually the LGBTQ community who were the victims. And you could see that because just by the simple matter of who was trying to get the government to protect them. It wasn't the LGBTQ community who was doing that. It was the others who were actually being the oppressing group. So I'll just share the screen again. Are we going for time? So we may not get through this whole study today, but if it's okay with Elder Terry, I can always continue at the next meeting if she's happy for me to do that. I'll just
You've still got a good half hour, Lynne.
Yes, and I'm just thinking, I'm kind of almost halfway through, so we'll see how we go. We'll just see. I could always try to speed it up a little too without rushing past the important points. So if you can see the screen now, hopefully you can see the correct screen. Is it this one that you're looking at? It's not showing up. It looks like I might have selected the wrong screen. Let me just... Sorry, I'll just do that once more and try and make sure I'm selecting the right screen. Correct one. There we go. Okay. So this is talking about Max again. It's gone back to that Vox article, and it's just talking about how Max was not a member of Gamergate proper, it says, because there were, as it says, this isn't terribly uncommon. Men's rights activists exist who disdain that particular episode, if not for its virulence, then for its celebration of men who prefer Dungeons and Dragons to Monday Night Football. So you see there's even division in these men's rights activist movement. Similarly, there are Gamergate activists who remain stubbornly committed to the idea that they are ethicists of video game journalism, wholly detached from men as a generalised political class. But these vagaries, the specific grievances of Gamergate, the sort of person who self-applies MRA, men's rights activist, versus the sort who prefers some other acronym, are merely symptoms of a broader male sense of victimhood. It is this victim complex that I intend to tell you about, not the particular schisms between reactionaries. I'm interested in the style of man who makes all such factions explicable, the kind who has in these last decades, felt the theoretical foundation of his inherited supremacy begin to crumble and gone into defensive crouch, lashing out at every grain of sand that shifts beneath his feet. So okay, I'll just stop the screen share. So to be clear, not everyone on that side of the fence is in total agreement about everything, but they all are in agreement about perceiving themselves as being oppressed for one reason or another. So they all see radical feminism as the enemy. And I might just, I'll do that in a minute. So they all see radical feminism as the enemy. So the men's rights activist movements and those who see feminism as they see women as the problem. So that's their enemy, joint enemy, if you like. And they all share that victim complex. And I'll just go back and share this next quote as well, which is also continuing with that Vox article. Okay. He orders us another round and continues on with what has become a familiar line from men's rights activists or new atheists or libertarians. Now you'll notice, take a note of the fact they recognise this far right trinity, and they actually did that not just once in the article, they did that a few times, I think 2 or 3 times. The explicit claim that they are the last remaining purveyors of reason. They just won't use logic talking about women or those feminists. I'm just arguing logically. I'm only interested in evidence. So they see themselves as the last bastion of logic and evidence. So you can't scroll down a comment section without flashing past a few of these types of comments. So you'll see when you're looking at social media sites with this type of mentality, that's the sort of statements that they will make. And it's saying that they are tribal markers, not actual real facts, but they're actually how you can pick up when you're sifting information. When you see these types of statements, you can actually recognize that's a tribal marker, not necessarily a real claim. Basically, Max says, I mean, it's ridiculous that these people go on about how I have so much power because I'm a white dude. And he continues, like Americans would rather elect a gay Muslim philanderer president than an atheist. Libertarians are treated like a joke. If you think people are mean to feminists on Twitter, you should see the stuff people say about MRAs, or just like, you know, die, white cis scum, die. Like basically clearly is identifying himself as a victim, not just in general, but online. So they're going to be looking at looking for ways that they can portray themselves as being the ones who are actually discriminated against, which is, as we've seen, exactly what oppressors tend to do. So it solidifies that secular trinity. And the whole passage really highlights the mindset and explains how these comments are tribal markers, not real claims, and that the Trinity all make the same sort of claims of victimhood regardless of the truth. And it's the second time this article mentions a Trinity. So, okay, so it was 2 times. So the article really highlights how the labels in some of these are interchangeable because they're united in their victimhood and in who they see as the enemy. So even though we know that men's rights activists see women as the enemy, we can say that these see the church as the enemy, but we can also recognise when we look further that they also see women as the enemy. And we also see that this is traditionally the state, but again, they may not recognise as easily as the enemy, but they still fight against equality because they're fighting for freedom. So therefore they end up, especially given where we stand with sexism currently, they actually end up making women the enemy as well. So they all have outwardly what you might see as a different enemy, but in actual fact, they're all really against the same enemy as from our particular perspective, what we can see from what we've learned. So they all claim to be the last remaining purveyors of reason. And so we need to listen for these types of phrases in order to recognize the tribal markers. So if we consider new atheism and listen to people like Richard Dawkins, because this is where we want to focus here. Basically, we've got, and the reason we want to focus is because as we look further into, we can see that all of these are really being channeled from this perspective or intertwined. So they're very, very connected. We see that people who listen to people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, you'll find that they use these phrases that we've just discussed as tribal markers. We just believe in facts. We are not using emotions. We're just looking logically, all of these sorts of things. And you also see Sam Harris or even Ben Shapiro also make these claims. They're only using logic. So they're fighting the church, the state, and women, but they're all using logic. They're all using the same issues. They're all having the same victimhood mentality. And if we consider the Sunday law as a combination of church and state, at first glance, you might think, okay, well, if these are against the church and the state, aren't we against a combination of that sort of thing? And so shouldn't they be on our side? You'd perhaps think that to start with. But the fact is that it's not like that at all, because if they're fighting against the influence of the church, then wouldn't you think they'd be on our side for a Sunday law? But in actual fact, we don't have a Sunday law. And in fact, we're not even going to have a problem with the combination of church and state. That's part of what we used to think because we were stuck in 1888 history. We didn't see that our test is a different test. So thinking about the combination of these things, and we think of following September 11 in 2001, there was militant atheism arose out of that, or from that time, and it led us to the 4 horsemen of modern atheism. And we know that the 4 horsemen were or are considered to be, even though they're not all still alive, but There's still, they coined this, called themselves the Four Horsemen of Modern Atheism, so more or less. And so we had Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and we've got Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. Now, he's less heard of, but still was a part of the four. So these were the four horsemen. Now, I'm not going to go into a full explanation or discussion because that's been done in other talks, but obviously there's a lot that could be said about them. But the most important thing is the rising up of this new atheist movement, even though some people will object to the fact it's called New Atheist Movement, which is fair enough because in actual fact it's really the old atheist movement that has continued. It's just become more popular, and so therefore it's taken on a new I suppose view. Excuse me one second. Just have a tickly throat that can sometimes start to play up. So for one example of how this atheist movement is so connected to the male activists in their attitudes, we can see that Christopher Hitchens had an article in 2007 Vanity Fair, and it was titled "Why Women Aren't Funny." Christopher Hitchens, sorry, I said Hutchins, I meant Hitch. Oh, I've written Hutchins. It's actually Hitchens, so let me correct that. So Christopher Hitchens has passed away, but we can also reference his comments in 2010 when he was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So that was an annual event where a lot of media people gathered at the White House and they'd have an evening. And in 2010, Obama was president and they had a comedian, Rhonda Sykes, performing at the end of the evening. Christopher Hitchens commented about her comedy presented that evening, and his comments were very telling. His comments said, "The president should be squirming in his seat, not smiling." And then he called her a name. And that name, which I won't leave on the board, but he called her, oops, can't spell now, which is actually quite a derogatory term in the way he used it as, well, it's a derogatory term. He said, "The got it wrong. No one told her the rules." So that was his comment. So it's an interesting thing. And the reason it's so, I suppose, concerning is the fact that it was a racist comment, first and foremost. And it was clearly also referencing her gender, because that's only reference to a female. But it's also referencing the fact that it's a slur against lesbian women. So he managed to make a slur in that statement against race, against women in general, and also lesbian women. So basically, this would be a slur against a woman who is identifies as lesbian and maybe has an appearance which might be seen to be more masculine, etc. So he attacks the color of her skin, her gender, her sexual orientation, and all he wanted to do was just say, in her opinion, he didn't like her comedy. So it's interesting that he chose that way to actually do that, because did he need to do that just to say he didn't think she was funny? And I would suggest no, he didn't. but that's how he chose to do it. So supposedly this is a man who uses logic and reason, and he also happens to use social evolution to explain why women aren't funny. And this is one of the most influential men of these four horsemen. And so when we look at someone like Christopher Hitchens, it's no surprise why we see people like Max, the 27-year-olds in 2017, have the opinions that they do, because it's these people who, and people like these people, because these aren't the only people who purport this philosophy, but it's these sorts of people who have been influencing people like Max, who claims to be an atheist. So his inspiration is coming from this sector of the community. And earlier we spoke about the two women, Sarah Henry interviewing Alex DeBranco, the two atheist women. And Alex mentioned during her early research into men's activism, she had been watching men like Paul Elam. And Paul Elam is the founder of the International Conference of Men's Issues and formerly the publisher of A Voice for Men. So here we see another influence on this sector of society. A Voice for Men is a publication which was considered to be on the online flagship for men's rights movements. Quoting directly from the source, from an article from A Voice for Men, it says, let's see if I can share the screen. Taking a minute, but it's getting there, I hope. Here we go. So hopefully you'll see that shortly. So I'll read the quote. I have often wondered if my state of mind, and this is Paul Elam, if my state of mind as an atheist has also played a role in becoming a men's rights activist. So this is making the connection. This is establishing, if you like, the pipeline. I like to think I view things objectively, that I rely on available science rather than faith or folklore to shape my beliefs. So here we see those culture identifiers. That attitude has certainly helped me understand issues like domestic violence and alleged wage gaps as much as it has evolution. So he's obviously become very knowledgeable on these topics, according to him. And what he's saying is, as the founder of the online flagship of men's rights movement, he's saying that he's wondered, and he goes on to say that the state of mind as an atheist plays a direct role in him being able to, as a men's rights activist, well, not just becoming one, but also in his ability to fight against things like feminists or Christians with their religious beliefs, just like he would basically comparing if he was fighting against somebody who believed in creation, for example. So he thinks he can do that on the same level. And so this identifies that pipeline, as I mentioned, between atheism and men's rights activists. So you see a definite connection. And he more or less states that as being the case from his observation. So going back briefly to that Vox article, the author interviewing Max, they talked about this trinity, and they can see in 2015 how this trinity is connected. So it's not hard to see when you look. And if you'd have to read that book called The New Jim Crow to understand the extent of racism in policing, as in the police force in the United States and in the courts in the United States. And reading a book like that can help us see the institutional racism that exists. Without us educating ourselves, we likely won't be able to see it. But once you do see it, then you can't unsee it. So the point of that is we learn not just by our experience in day-to-day life, but also by education. It's a combination of both, which helps us to see the vast need for equality. The more we become educated on these topics, the more we experience these things, we can actually see the need for something that's going to govern freedom, not just freedom being unfettered, allowed to run its course on its own, and that being the only important thing. So Elder Tess actually did share a quote from a friend of hers at the time, where it just points out, quote, this person, it says, a human being could not have constructed the Eden to Eden model, could not have constructed what this movement taught prior to 2018, and certainly not since 2018. A human being is not capable of it. There is evidence. A human being themselves could not have predicted what would happen between Russia and the United States at the end of 2021. So we see, even in the movement, that we have been given evidence. God expects us to educate ourselves with what's going on externally as well as internally, and that gives us the evidence. And then we also have our experience through how the movement has progressed from where we used to be here to where we are now over here. And it's also not difficult to see the link between these three and how there's a pipeline. Now, Phil Torres is a firm atheist, and there's a lot, I don't know if you remember, but there was an article Elder Tess put up about, it was written for Salon, and it was in 2017, and he goes a little bit into the history of New, and the point of us looking at this is someone who is a firm atheist. He's a biologist, a science communicator, a photographer, a television host, based in New York City. He does projects all over the globe. And the reason we're mentioning him is because even as an atheist, he started to recognize there was a problem. So he actually went in and spoke about what he saw as being something that he was ashamed to be a part of. And the title of that article is From the Enlightenment to the Dark Ages, How New Atheism Slid into the Alt-Right. And the subtitle is also interesting because it was a movement supposedly committed to science and reason has decayed into racism, misogyny, and intolerance. I'm done. So he was announcing his departure from those who previously he had been a part of. So he's still an atheist, but he can see that there's a very unhealthy connection to misogyny and racism and a whole lot of problems. So to quote a little bit of the article, the new atheist movement emerged shortly after 9/11 attacks with a best-selling book by Sam Harris called The End of Faith. So Sam Harris. This was followed by engaging tomes, Christopher Hitchens, among others. Avowing to champion the values of science and reason, the movement offered a growing number of unbelievers. Tired of faith-based foolishness mucking up society for the rest of us, some hope for the future. For many years, I was among the new atheism movement's greatest allies. And then he goes into all the problems of new atheism, which is really just a description of what we've already said. The rampant misogyny we've discussed, and the racism as yet, but which exists. Now, I won't necessarily have time to go into it all, but further down in the article, it goes into subsequent statements about profiling at airports, serious allegations of rape at atheist conferences, and tweets from major leaders that linked to white supremacist websites, further alienated women, people of colour, and folks that one could perhaps describe as morally normal. Yet some of us, mostly white men like myself, persisted in our conviction that overall the new atheist movement was still a force for good in the world. It is an extraordinary personal embarrassment that I maintained this view until this present year. So he really maintained this view up until this point in time. But Elder Tess did point out a little bit of incongruity, because it was almost like the title of his article was actually sort of making it into this misogynistic view over time, whereas really it was always there. So he was kind of giving a bit of an out for himself at the time. So I won't go into all any further details there, because I think we sort of get the point. So There's some other really quite disgusting quotes that you could look at that really identify the truth behind the misogynism that exists with this new atheism and that mentality. So moving on. You can see how the connection, I think it's pretty clear to see the connection between these movements in particular. And we know from the Vox article and Max that a large proportion of society don't necessarily call themselves men's activists, yet they still listen to Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and so their worldview is molded by what they're listening to. So therefore, even though they don't label themselves as such, they actually purport the same ideologies. So they're still really assisting that group of society who do label themselves proudly as that. And we can see that religion, Christianity in particular, is not the root of the problem or the cause of the problem, especially when you look at worldwide. Like, it's not the problem in South Korea, it's not the problem in Australia or Romania or Brazil. The root of the problem isn't Protestantism, and it's not even the cause. So we can see that this is the biggest threat to what we see as the Sunday law issue for us, being sexism and the fight for equality. And I did point out before that all of these movements, even libertarianism, are against gender equality. And that's the key point that unites them all. And we also noticed that there's a disproportionate amount of these people on this side as opposed to in the population in general. So there's a lot of brazen sexism, and behind this new atheism and this type of reasoning and thinking it's often been connected to social Darwinism, even though that's not popular in today's terms, because they can see that Nazi Germany was very much based on that kind of perception and beliefs. However, it's still, as is, you can quote from Philip Kitchener, who's a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. He wrote in the New York Times in 2012, the first tenet of social Darwinism is the belief that people have intrinsic abilities and talents and correspondingly intrinsic weaknesses. Now, we see when we're looking at the feminist movements, and you look at the counterfeit feminism movements, if you like, you've got cultural feminism and liberal feminism. Particularly cultural feminism really highlights these so-called intrinsic differences between men and women. You're born with those differences in their opinion, and consequently it then brings them in direct conflict with radical feminism, and also with our view, which is that we're not born with intrinsic differences at all in the concept of equality, within the construct of equality. So they feel, those who hold these views basically feel that evolution has developed certain aspects of maleness and certain aspects of femaleness, and as such, this is how they can justify their view. And when you look at people like Hitchens, who stated that women over millions of years have developed an intrinsic ability to be cunning minxes. So, you know, that terminology. And when you look at what he also, how he portrays women, or a person of colour who's also a lesbian, who is also a woman, how he's inclined to portray that person. And this is how he can justify it, because it's actually something that women have learned through evolution to manipulate men, and therefore they become the dominant force, even in a patriarchal society. And they can suppress men, even in a patriarchal society, from their perspective, because they see them as being able to use these developed talents to be able to control and influence men. And basically, that's their strength in his view. And Hitchens also says their intrinsic weakness, which makes them not funny. Basically, they lack a sense of humour, whereas males had to develop a sense of humour in order to win the females for purposes of breeding, etc. So they developed an intrinsic ability, this is women, to be nurturing and to raise children. Therefore, they have intrinsic weakness when it comes to conflict and rational thought. And this is Sam Harris's view. So they all share similar views to the degree that it's a problem. So social Darwinism has definitely had a huge influence on how atheists can justify their thinking. And they're just doing it from what they see as a scientific, logical point of view. So we've probably all heard of the book of Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And this is really another concept within Christian circles often purported to be really talking about gender essentialism and social Darwinist ideas. So in the atheist movement, social Darwinism obviously plays out the justifiable assault of women by naturally aggressive men. So they explain away domestic violence or the men's natural aggression which has developed through the years, millions of years, in order for them to be the providers, the hunters, etc. And so they kind of make an excuse, even to the point where they will blame a woman that you don't want to get drunk around a man because what else can you expect? He might rape you because he's developed this natural aggression and you should be aware of that. So therefore, it's obviously your fault if you're going to drink and become drunk around a man with this clearly something he's unable to control. So that's why probably even in atheist conventions, it's not uncommon for women to be mocked or harassed or even assaulted and raped. It's basically biological essentialism, which is used to rationalize these sex crimes and harassment. So this is a dangerous perspective to take. And there's become a form of acceptance of sexual harassment to the point where it's seen as humorous even. And it's just what men do when they're drunk. It's a common explanation, or a common saying like boys will be boys. So they explain it away. And then they say, well, it wasn't because God created it, because they're atheists, because they don't believe in God, but it's because millions of years of biological essentialism has created these intrinsic strengths and intrinsic weaknesses. Whereas in Christianity, even though they don't necessarily want to excuse it as being okay, they can allow for the fact in their mind that God created boys differently than how God created men. Whereas we know when we've studied Eden to Eden and we look back, that's not really true, because God created everyone equal, men and women, male and female. So it's justifying sexual violence. It's blaming the women for their style of dress or the fact that they've drunk a bit too much. And even we saw that with Max in the article where he commented on the waitress's attire, which he saw as manipulative to gain her advantages. So it was clearly this same type of thinking. And it's all Darwinism, and it leads you to this type of conclusion. So the fact that it's all become more militant in this 21st century even highlights the greater the influence that it's having on this right side of the equation. So because this talk originally was called Atheism and the New Crusade, it's because this militant atheism has risen since 2001 to the point where they want to eradicate religion from society, because they see that as the thing that's bringing the problems to society. But we also see that even though they think that, they also hold these other, Darwinism type, social Darwinism type views, which have led them to become really all very similar in their outlook. So moving on, I'll see if I can bring this to a close, because obviously we're getting near the end. and I am getting close to the end here. So I'll just bring out the fact that, to conclude, we can see that Protestantism is not the whole. We can see it's not the cause, but we can see that this far-right Trinity is a bigger problem on the overall scale of what's happening in society and the development of this younger group of society, which is even, so it's not the older, more conservative right Christian males, if you like, that are ruling this, even though they still exist. It's actually the younger, more militant activists who are very consistent with their beliefs, even if they don't accept the label, they actually do exhibit the same mentality, the same ethos underlying what they're wanting for society. And the way their right-wing thinking is all connected. So when we combine this study with Elder Terry's recent studies for Vespers, where she's been going through the roots of atheism and, as I mentioned before, paganism, the daily, plus the fact that it is actually indeed a religious power, we can start to see how it's actually a significant part of the dragon from Revelation 16:13. And I'm sure Elder Terry's still got more to develop in regard to that point. But I think it really highlights the need for us as a movement to be aware of the broad scale problem. It's not just this narrow problem. It's actually a very much bigger issue that's influencing the whole of society. So that's concluding my presentation for today, and we'll kneel and have a prayer, and then if we can have some comments after that, if there is any, or any questions. Dear Lord God, again, we thank you for the opportunity to come and study these subjects. We know that we need to go over and over these concepts so that we can firmly reform our thinking, because our thinking was once very mingled with this distorted view of your government. We didn't understand once upon a time, even though now we're hopefully learning more, we didn't understand just how important equality was, with how important that concept was to be able to govern freedom, even though freedom still exists and still needs to exist. Adam and Eve had the freedom to choose. They allowed freedom to be the most important thing. And we have done this traditionally over the years. So we are gaining more insight, and we thank you for this, that you've been able to reveal this through those who have been studying and your messengers. We just thank you for all the blessings that you've given to us these past 30 years, really, at least. And we just thank you for where we stand, and we ask that you'll continue to uphold us, keep us on that path, help us to keep seeing the midnight cry message, the two streams, help us to be able to discern those small nuances that we're getting down now into the details, and we're starting to sift things from the left, because we can see that, there's people on the left who in some ways stand more with those on the right than with those on the left. So we have to be very mindful of how we sift the information there, and not just accept things blatantly, but rather just learn to think more like you. And we pray for your leading in each one of our hearts and minds, that we may be able to think more like you and see things the way you would have us see them. And we pray for all those, particularly anyone in our families who might be overtaken with some of these other opposite views that we know are making them stand in the wrong stream. And we just do pray that you will help us to be able to be a good example to anyone we come in contact with, whether it's family or friends or anyone else. And we just pray for a continued blessing as we go through the Sabbath. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.